There are many points of comparison between the status of democracy in both Venezuela and Belarus, as well as the various ways in which their respective governments and leaders have managed to maintain authoritarian control of their populations, in spite of the increasing pressure by international institutions to democratize. The leaders of Venezuela and Belarus each came to power through free and fair elections, but have since become increasingly corrupt, leading their countries deeper into authoritarian socialist rule, despite increasing international pressure to democratize. An evaluation of their similarities can provide insight as to how the two have managed to maintain authoritarian regimes despite external pressures and eroding economies, and how both have managed to steer their countries away from democratization. Belarus has had no historical experience of a democratic regime. In fact, many Belarusians consider the Soviet era to be the golden age. Following World War II, the economy had become highly industrialized with some diversification of production. Its location makes it an important pathway between Central, Eastern, and Western Europe, a position Lukashenko still uses to his advantage in dealing with foreign entities. Like most other post-Soviet countries, Belarus was and is still dependent on Russian energy imports, and its markets were mainly in other Soviet republics, while its goods were uncompetitive on Western markets at the time of dissolution. However, Belarus's economy was in a much better condition than most other post-Soviet republics, with living conditions comparable to conditions in the West. This changed over the next few years as living conditions, which in 1992 were the highest in the Commonwealth of Independent States, had already begun to plummet by the following year. The government attempted to gradually democratize the country within the political vacuum they were left in, allowing for the development of a previously non-existent civil society. The reforms, however, left the country in economic and political disarray, leading to public outrage and the addition of the post of president in the Belarusian constitution in 1994. The economy was in such dire straits that the Consumer Price Index, a measurement that reflects the annual percentage changed in the cost to the average consumer of acquiring a basket of goods and services fixed at yearly intervals, reached an astronomical rate of 2,221%. The fourth highest in the whole world according to the World Bank. That same year, in 1994, the country held its first democratic presidential elections, which, driven by popular discontent with government corruption, set the stage for the victory of Alexander Lukashenko, who had previously been the chairman of the Anti-Corruption Committee of the Belarusian Parliament, and ran on an anti-corruption platform. Lukashenko won by an overwhelming majority in what was deemed a free and fair election, but has since maintained his position through a series of fraudulent elections and economic and political reforms designed to consolidate power within the executive branch, including the elimination of term limits. Once in power, he reinstated the collectivist state-controlled system that Belarusians were comfortable with. While in the West this appears to be a step in the wrong direction, his orientation toward old Soviet policies made people feel secure and was a major factor in his early popularity. International pressure, such as economic sanctions by the European Union and the United Nations, has pressured the government to make various concessions to the West. However, the Belarusian government has only done so because of its need for financial assistance. Similarly, the Chavez regime in Venezuela has managed to avert international pressure to democratize, instead favoring a command economy and authoritarian government, though that was not always the case. From 1958 to the early 1970s, Venezuela was a democratic showcase for the Southern Hemisphere. In fact, in 1960, Venezuela's gross domestic product per worker was comparable to that of the United States, Canada, Switzerland, and Australia. Massive oil income in the mid-1970s, however, led to a deterioration in the quality of government and an increase in corruption. Like Lukashenko, Hugo Chavez came to power during an economic and political crisis, which, in 1998, led the public to seek him as outside of corrupt politics. President Chavez came to power in 1998 through a legitimate election, but has since maintained power through the drafting of a new constitution and has transformed the legislature and courts into branches stocked with supporters, virtually eliminating a system of checks and balances and allowing him to quash opposition at any and all costs. In 2009, Chavez won a referendum eliminating term limits for elected officials, placing his goal of ruling for years to come closer within his reach. Corruption in both Venezuela and Belarus is among the worst in the world. Transparency International conducts surveys of perceived corruption annually. The countries are scored on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the least corrupt. Going back to 2001, Venezuela has not managed to score over a 2.8, indicating that its population considers the government to be extremely corrupt. Belarus's scores were pretty much the same as Venezuela's, apart from a couple years in the early 2000s. Their scores, compared to the United States, provide some clue as to just how dire the political situation is in both Venezuela and Belarus. Electoral corruption and the repression of political opposition are both serious problems in Venezuela and Belarus. The European Union, the United Nations, and the United States all imposed sanctions on Belarus for December 2010's fraudulent elections. Included in this chaos was the detainment of Lukashenko's political opponents, including presidential candidate Andrei Sarnikov, along with hundreds of peaceful protesters. Another example of electoral corruption is exemplified by the 2008 Belarusian elections, in which all 110 parliamentary seats were filled with pro-Lukashenko candidates. Not one of the 70 opposition candidates won a single parliamentary seat. These political prisoners have been released from custody as part of Lukashenko's cat-and-mouse game with the West, in which he releases political prisoners to allay the West whenever sanctions are imposed for human rights violations. In doing so, he is able to appear cooperative without actually having to make any improvements to his authoritarian practices. In Venezuela, the electoral registry is filled with virtual voters, such as a man named Jose Gregorio Gonzalez Rodriguez, born on August 4, 1962, who is listed 62 times under different identity card numbers and hence is able to vote that many times. This problem is largely being dealt with from the outside, with bodies such as the United Nations imposing sanctions for fraudulent elections. Unfortunately, not much change has occurred as a result. Individuals cannot form effective opposition to the existing regimes in Belarus and Venezuela because corruption in the government only serves to bolster the power of Lukashenko and Chavez, who will do practically anything to remain in office. The opponents of both men have been arrested and tortured as examples to anyone considering a revolution. Venezuela holds the world's largest oil reserves, which is what allows Chavez to cling to his position. In fact, the state-owned company Petróleos de Venezuela has been dealing with Belarus's state oil firm, Belarusneft, as President Lukashenko is in desperate need of cheap energy, following out with Russian oil companies. Plunging oil revenues are expected to hit the Venezuelan economy and the petro-fueled Chavez diplomacy soon. The consequences of this would be the same kind of stagflation and devaluation of the Bolivar currency, a similar situation to the one that undid the power of previous Venezuelan leaders. A political and economic crisis in Venezuela in 2003 led to a coup attempt and a 2-month-long national strike. The Venezuelan media roused it. Once deposed, however, the media could not follow through, and eventually the population had Chavez placed back in power. In a move to ensure this will not happen again, in 2004, Chavez passed the law of social responsibility in radio and television. This law makes it illegal for broadcasters to propagate information that will promote, defend, or incite breaches of public order, or are contrary to the security of the nation. Such vague language allows for harsh repression of private journalism. This does not mean, however, that media are entirely restricted from reporting on social crises, because doing so allows him to deflect some international criticisms. Further, Chavez has expanded the size of the state and has nationalized key sectors of the Venezuelan economy, such as oil, electricity, and telecommunications, feeding into Chavez's wallet and ego. The outlook for democracy in the future is not bright in either Venezuela or Belarus. The Venezuelan and Belarusian governments have managed to step up repressive measures with little resistance from the democratic world. International efforts to democratize Belarus and Venezuela have been largely unsuccessful. Their authoritarian leaders are reluctant to appear as if conceding to Western demands, despite their economic predicaments. Increasing inflation has forced Alexander Lukashenko to make concessions to the West, while plummeting oil prices may lead to a regime change. If only the opposition could get its act together. For now, it appears that international sanctions and incentives have not given Belarus and Venezuela enough of a reason to make any real steps in the right direction.